Recording in progress.
Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the 2021 Geneva Trade Week on Trade for Peace, Back to Basics. This session, which will also be aired as a Trade for Peace podcast episode, which you can now find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, among other platforms, is in a way an extension of the high-level opening plenary that we had on Monday, the 27th of October, that focused on the critical intersection of trade and peace building. As one of those who stood at the beginning of the Trade for Peace initiative in December 2017, when I represented Liberia as one of the two co-founders of the G7 Plus WTO Accessions Group in Buenos Aires, I should mention that our discussion this week marked exactly 3 years since the first outreach event under this vital initiative that took place at the 2018 WTO Public Forum with the participation of the first president of Timor-Leste and the eminent person of the G7 Plus, His Excellency Xanana Gusmão, bringing the trade and peace nexus to the attention of the world international community. Today, we are most honored to engage in a conversation with two pioneers and champions of trade for peace who need no introduction, Ambassador Alan Wolf, former Deputy Director General, and Dr. Elder Da Costa, General Secretary of the G7 Plus. Before joining the Peterson Institute for International Economics as a distinguished visiting fellow, Ambassador Alan Wolf served as Deputy Director General of the WTO from October 2017 to March 2021. Prior to that, from 2011 to 2017, he chaired the National Foreign Trade Council, created by President Wilson in 1914 to support open international trade. Alan previously served at the Office of the United States Trade Representative in the U.S. Treasury Department. Dr. Elder Da Costa is the General Secretary of the G7 Plus Secretariat, based in Dili, Timor-Leste, providing services to 20 post-conflict countries around the world. Dr. Da Costa was the G7 Plus Sherpa during the Busan High-Level Forum and represented the G7 Plus constituency in the steering committee of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation from 2012 to 2014. He is one of the champions of the building blocks on conflict and fragility, which is essentially the New Deal for international engagement in fragile states. In today's session, we will explore the origins of the initiatives and its relevance to the G7 Plus and the GATT WTO context, and the overall linkages between trade, peace building efforts, and transition of fragile and conflict affected states towards resilience. We will also explore how the WTO membership can be used to address challenges faced by such states on their path towards building inclusive, sustainable peace through various types of partnership. Ambassador Wolf, Dr. DaCosta, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Axel. It's good to be with you, with Dr. DaCosta, to talk about this important topic. Two examples come to mind of the dominant examples of where Trade for Peace comes from currently, where the linkage comes from. One is the President Wilson, you mentioned him, who called for the establishment of the National Foreign Trade Council in the U.S. In 1919, he was at the Paris Peace Conference, and he put on the table 14 points. And one of those points was the removal, as far as possible, of all economic barriers and the establishment of an equality of trade conditions among all nations consenting to the peace and associating themselves for its maintenance. That didn't work. The 14 points were adopted, but never really implemented. And the world paid a high price for that. The effort, however, didn't die there, because the next generation of American leaders and other leaders took on that task of linking trade and peace. In the mid-1940s, the planners for the post-war era, among them, of course, led by Franklin Roosevelt in the United States and Winston Churchill in the United Kingdom, picked up this thread, and they dedicated themselves to learning from experience, having come through two horrible world wars, separated only by a Great Depression. A central pillar of their vision was a more open and rules-based trading system, and the form of an international trade organization. And that didn't come into being either, but the charter led off with the following words: recognizing the determination of the United Nations to create conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations, the parties to this charter undertake in the fields of trade and employment to cooperate with one another and with the United Nations. Well, the ITO charter was not adopted. The U.S. Senate didn't ratify it, but the fact is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade picked up the trade rules, and the system was born in the atmosphere of serving the cause of trade and peace. The second major endeavor that we can look to, linking trade and peace, was the European experience after World War II. First, the European Coal and Steel Community, followed by the agreement to form a common market, and finally the European Union. Jean Monnet, the father of European integration, believed in the creation of a Pax Mercantoria, a peace achieved through integration of markets, initially restricted to energy market, the coal and steel community, and then extended to other sectors until a single market was formed. This powerful motivation for European integration was still strong decades later when the EU expanded to the east. And it said, those who were responsible officials at the EU Commission said at the time, our purpose is to spread peace through trade. The strong linkage of trade and peace doesn't mean it's foolproof. There are lots of examples in history where it has not worked. Carthage and Rome traded extensively with each other, and of course went to war. In fact, trade had been weaponized by Carthage. They blocked Rome from Carthaginian markets in the Mediterranean, and eventually Carthage was vanquished. Sometimes the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt, is blamed for cutting off supplies of raw materials and oil to Japan. I don't subscribe to the theory that that caused World War II. I don't think it did. But the fact that there was a lot of trade between the United States and Japan didn't prevent them from going to war, nor the two sides in the U.S. Civil War, the North and the South, that of course traded extensively with each other, nor the United Kingdom and the United States before the Revolution, having traded a lot with each other, or Germany and the UK before two world wars. So it's not a guarantee of peace, but it helps a great deal. The there's not, when the WTO was formed, a threat of global war. The German reunification had just taken place. In 1990, the Cold War had ended. In 1989, the Cold War was over. So there wasn't a lot said about trade and peace when the WTO was founded, but it's not irrelevant. War had not been extinguished on this planet. The intrastate wars became frequent. On the continent of Africa alone, within 5 years preceding the founding of the WTO, fully 1/3 of the African countries had experienced armed conflict. Many of them were still in conflict. The Bosnian War was spilling blood in Europe. There were armed conflicts on the periphery of Russia and in Moscow itself. There was a civil war in Afghanistan. There was war in the Gulf and within Yemen. In short, the world was not entirely at peace. But there was nothing on the scale of the first two world wars. By 1995, trade and economic integration had underwritten an enduring European peace and an Asian peace with Japan, but it had not been a solution applied equally to all. This anomaly, trade for peace for the larger and more industrialized countries on the one hand, but insufficiently thought about in connection with the smallest, least developed, conflict-affected countries, was recognized in the founding of the G+7 accessions group at MC11, which Elda, I know, is going to talk about. And Axel was there, as was I, cheering the group on. The desire was to help build stability, give these countries a greater chance at achieving a durable peace through trade. And that's pretty much the pedigree, which is an impressive one. And I'll look forward to hearing comments from Dr. DaCosta.
Thank you, Adam, for that historical perspective. Now, over to you, Elda. Like many of us, I was quite excited to hear the remarks of His Excellency Dr. Jose Ramos Horta, the former president of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and the special envoy for the G7+, in which he summarized the perspective of the G7+ on the role of trade in addressing fragility. I would like to ask you about the origins of the G7+ initiative and the view of the G7+ on trade for peace. Why and to what extent is trade of critical importance for fragile and conflict-affected states? Perhaps you could also give some concrete examples with the current countries you're working with.
Thank you, Axie, and it's such a great honor for me to join on behalf of the G7+ group in this panel conversation with Ambassador Alan Wolf, who is the architect of Trade for Peace, along with you, Axel, in the beginning in 2017. But let me contextualize why the G7+ is striving for peace as the cornerstone of our plight. Back in the early 2000 onwards, when the old MDG came into force, we failed to achieve any single MDGs at the global level, the fragile and conflict-affected states around the world. So after the new SDGs, came into life, and it was an agenda was set up by the United Nations, what was missing in the previous MDG was an element of peace. The architecture of peace element is not there. All MDGs more focused on social and economic indicators, but not peace. Luckily, that we, the G7+, since we established a decade ago, to be precise, in Dili, Timor-Leste in 2010, a group of fragile and conflict-affected states came together and discussed about fragility, conflict in their own country, and decided to set up this informal association voluntary group, which we now call the G7+, which is comprised of 20 countries, which I'm honored to serve as their Secretary General. But in our trajectory over the past 10 years, our countries have already gained a lot of positive benefits by joining WTO. Let me, before I get into that, let me just reverse back by saying that The G7 Plus was established purely at the backdrop of the rising poverty and conflict in the world's fragile countries. And also we established because the foreign aid has not been effective in our countries. That's why we call for a new framework of engagement. We call it the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, which came with the peace building and state building components with 5 objectives, including justice, economic foundations, service delivery, and so on. So why we call for this New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, which by default also will translate into engagement in trade around the world? Because we see that once the peace building and state building is already ingrained in the mindset of the development partners within our countries, then we can move towards another path of resilience by engaging trade with other partner countries in the region or also at the global level. So, as you all remember that during the discussion of the Agenda 2030, there were 5 P's, like peace, people talk about planet, about our people, about peace, about prosperity, and also about the partnership. Now, this element of peace that we also subscribe to. So what with the G7 Plus, these 20 country members see that by joining WTO, trade for peace, it will play a greater role in supporting fragile and conflict-affected states, using trade as a stabilizer to promote inclusive and sustainable peace. So we are very proud and pleased and honored when we visited Geneva, met with Ambassador Wolf, at the time as a Deputy Director General of WTO, and also with all other brain power within the WTO headquarters. We found this terminology, this buzzword about trade for peace. And for us, it is a music in our ears, because at least a multilateral organization like WTO embraced this concept of WTO, peace, trade for peace. And we found out that our leaders, when they joined in Buenos Aires in 2017, and they brought this idea to create this trade for peace, which is now flourishing in my humble opinion. So we subscribe to that. So to end this early conversation, I'd like to say that I'm all saying that aid creates dependency, while trade creates independence. And trade has proved to be the means of shared prosperity among countries. This is also true for countries affected by conflict and fragility in our region. Because of that, we also believe that trade helps in creating employment opportunities. Yeah, because our countries are most heavily populated by youth. There's a youth bulge in our countries. I believe in your country as well, actually, and Liberia, and the youth bulge is already predominant in our. So how can trade create this positive impact and employment opportunities for women, children, and youth in our country? That's a big challenge. So it is in that context that we are very much hoping that the WTO can help our member states in acceding, in joining WTO, so we can learn from your experience and in order to benefit our people. That's the noble idea that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder, for providing the in-depth perspective on the origin of the G7 Plus. Now, before I turn the floor to participants' question, I would like to ask one final question. As you know, the WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala said in her opening statement this Monday that trade and peace, and I quote, are umbilically connected in the history of the multilateral trading system, end quote. How relevant is that statement to today's reality? I'd like to start with you, Alan.
Thank you, Axel. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the countries coming into the WTO, 23 are in the accession queue, applying for membership in the WTO. Many of them are conflict affected or were recently: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Sudan, Libya, Iraq. The last 2 who joined, of course, the WTO has been mentioned, Afghanistan and Liberia in 2016. Not strangers to domestic problems, conflict. And those who are coming in on their accession journeys most recently, such as Somalia, Timor-Leste, well represented by Elda here, South Sudan, all have suffered through war. Just before the pandemic brought the lockdown in February of 2020, Axel, you and I were in Addis Ababa, visiting with the Ethiopian government and with countries seeking accession to the WTO from the Horn of Africa. And that part of the world has seen more than its share of conflict. It was renewing its commitment to the WTO. The actions of these countries are a testament to the role of the WTO accessions process in being a key instrument in the creation of credible trade and policy frameworks for recovery, state building, and the promotion of peace. In my years at the WTO, it was 2017 through March of this year, there were many occasions when representatives of the least developed, conflict-affected countries confirmed that it was their firm belief that the linkage of trade and peace were essential to their country's future well-being. For them, it was not something theoretical or remote, and not something just contained in history books. It was a pressing current reality. Integration into the world economy was a path forward that they were choosing toward the central objective of attaining peace and a better world, a better environment for their country's people. At the 2018 Public Forum, as mentioned, I moderated a program which featured speakers from Somalia, South Sudan, Afghanistan, and Timor-Leste. The subject was bringing fragile, conflict-affected countries into the WTO. They wanted their countries to become integrated into the world economy to provide an economic basis for greater assurance that it was possible to maintain peace. And I asked the keynote speaker, the first president of Timor-Leste, Xanana Gusmão, to make some closing remarks. And the room felt hushed. Listened very carefully to this man who was an apostle of trade for peace in reality. He spoke about the need for his country to engage in world commerce, which was why the WTO was so important to his country's future. At a subsequent discussion, I saw the ambassadors of Sudan and South Sudan sitting next to each other on a panel, and they spoke the same words to express a common sentiment. They said, where there's trade, there's peace. Of course, the two elements have a symbiotic relationship. Trade and peace are preconditions for each other. The G7 Plus Accessions Group was launched by 8 vulnerable, least developed countries that have suffered long conflict and from instability. 3 WTO members, Afghanistan, Liberia, and Yemen, 5 exceeding governments, Comoros, Sao Tome and Principe, Somalia, South Sudan, and Timor-Leste. Each is qualified to testify. We're going to hear further from Dr. Costa on this, as to why they pledged together to this process of accession in the WTO to promote peace building and sustainable development, and why they believe the prospects are good for this path to be the right one. Since 2017, the Trade for Peace initiative has been extended to other conflict-affected and fragile states, which are currently in the process of joining the organization. Sudan became a new member of the group. The G7 Plus group actively promoted its agenda and participated and organized a series of Trade for Peace events during the last 4 years, including in collaboration with the Geneva Peace Building Platform, a great endeavor. At the WTO's second regional dialogue on WTO accessions for the Greater Horn of Africa, which took place in Djibouti in December of 2018, participants and speakers in the dialogue recognized the Trade for Peace through WTO Accessions Initiative was a way in which the WTO could contribute to regional peace building efforts in the Greater Horn of Africa and in other parts of the world. From these beginnings, the WTO embarked on a collaboration with representatives of the peace community in Geneva to determine how best we could collaborate to understand the needs of the conflict affected accurately, to pool resources, each pursuing its own mandate reinforced by each other's efforts. In February 2019, an exploratory meeting took place in Geneva among these organizations. The common purpose was to share experiences across trade and peace communities, to brainstorm promising topics for future discussions, and the establishment of a high-level panel or expert group on trade for peace, to identify a panel list of WTO exceeding governments where the Trade for Peace initiative could be implemented, and to discuss how to feature trade for peace during a series of WTO events, including, as it turned out, a great podcast by Mr. Axel Abity. As the Aswan Forum for Sustainable Peace and Development in March of this year, I noted that the regional dialogue organized by the WTO in Addis Ababa, Ambassador Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Trade and Industry of the African Union, stated that the AFCFTA can assist in, he said, silencing the guns in Africa. Regional trade agreements clearly can also foster peace. The AFCFTA makes an explicit link between the trade and peace, as did the 1948 Havana Charter for the International Trade Organization. It says, in Article 3, create a single market for goods, services, facilitated by movement of persons in order to deepen the economic integration of the African continent and in accordance with the Pan-African vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, enshrined in the Agenda 2063. It's clear this regional continental free trade agreement shares a common heritage with the WTO, the use of trade for peace. Yesterday, I spoke virtually at a London School of Economics event on the subject of Africa and the WTO and in the AFCFTA. 9 of the countries currently seeking to join the WTO are from Africa. The benefits of the regional trade agreement and the WTO are what they seek to use to build peace and have a better life for their peoples. They raise the standard of living of their peoples to bring added stability and the prospects for achieving peace, a sustainable peace, well-being, and development. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. And over to you, Elder. Your mic is on mute, Elder.
Thank you, Axel. From our perspective, we believe that, however, free trade and investment have been the source of stability and development for the rest of the world. Poor and particularly fragile and conflict-affected states are among the farthest left behind. That's the fact. And also, as you know, the world's free trade system operates on the premise of competition. And the world's mightiest nations have been always the winners, and the losers are the smaller countries. And I must say that the competition is not always fair, as Ambassador Alan Wolf knows better than I do. However, countries with low capacity and fragile economies like ours have not been able to reap the benefits of the flow of trade. So let's take natural resources from our countries as an example. In my country, Timor-Leste, before our leaders engaged in the famous maritime boundary negotiation from a fragile country with a giant neighbor like Australia on maritime boundary negotiation, the country needs to strive for peace first. The peace dividends has to be bought, has to be fought. And that's the experience of Timor-Leste. And it took almost a decade to do that since we again restore our independence period from the United Nations. Now, once the country is in peace, then the leaders, or at least the government, can engage in a peaceful manner, negotiation on managing the natural resources within the maritime, within the sovereign power, in order to be able to reap the benefits of the people, including applying or acceding the WTO as a multilateral trade organization. That's what Timor-Leste is among the other 9 that they wanted to apply for being a member of WTO. On the other opposite example, you can take example as Afghanistan. Just a month or 2 months ago, we celebrated 5 years, Afghanistan joining WTO. But what happened afterwards? Suddenly, the Taliban took over the country. The country is in tatters at the moment. So that means that the gains that we really the country reaped from the past 20 years may or may not be dissipated. We don't know yet. So it's still too early to judge. So this is just to show the dynamic of the two opposite examples of one country strives for peace in order to get stability, but the other country has got stability. But at the end, suddenly you got this bumpy road ahead. So on the other hand, repeated cycles of conflict reverse the gains that we could even make. And you saw the example that I just mentioned earlier on. So the concrete steps in our view, Axel, that we need to take are as follows. First, we need peace as it is a precondition for trade and development. And that's what I'm so glad that this peace, Trade for Peace initiative or network has already been established, and it will definitely flourish among all the champions around the table. Second, we need to invest in physical and soft infrastructure in those countries. The foreign aid should focus on building infrastructure and strengthening the economic foundation and support the leaders of the country in order to support the development agenda based on country-led and country-owned development initiatives. And the last one, the world trade system needs to become inclusive and fair. And this is in the domain of former Ambassador Alan Wolf, you know very well. That this can only happen if the needs of the context of conflict-affected states are taken into consideration. So we believe that the G7 plus WTO accession group is the best forum to force that conversation within WTO and the leaders of the G7 plus countries.
Thank you, Elder, and thanks for responding to that question. Now, I would like to turn to the participants' question. The first question, this will go to you, Alan. After World War II, the creation of the Multilateral Trading Organization was part of a single post-war peace project that combined economic development with the protection of human rights to create long-lasting world peace. What do you see as the relationship between international trade and human rights in today's pursuit of peace? I think you've touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's a strong connection. The fact of the matter is that the world trading system over the last 70 years has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. There's been no more dramatic movement of people towards well-being over this time. Peace was a necessary precondition, and trade was aiding and sustaining that peace. The WTO is what the members want it to be. The rule book is what the countries of the world have decided it should be. And they've decided that the other economic institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, are doing their job to better the conditions for all peoples, and that includes human rights. Now, specifically, if a country wants to mention a specific problem, the United States, I understand, has raised in the fisheries talks an issue of labor rights, for example. That's something that they can do. But more fundamentally, if you look at the fisheries subsidies negotiation, what's that all about? It's about the most seriously affected by subsidies by these fleets of factory ships, taking away the livelihoods of domestic fishermen. And what happens in Somalia? The fishermen, in many cases, turn to piracy. So conflict is created by failing to regulate some of the excesses of trade, such as in fishery subsidies. So it's a theme that comes through. It's not trade is not a cure-all, but it underwrites improvements in the conditions of humanity, and in general, it is leading to a better condition of human rights. For specific problems, there are also other specialized agencies who are dedicated to resolving those.
Thank you, Alan. And over to you, Elder. What do you see as the relationship between trade and human rights, especially in the context of Timor-Leste?
Well, in the context of Timor-Leste, my country has experienced human rights violations before we got our own independence, as you know. But as a country that emerged from this experience, the bitter experience in facing human rights, we learned a lot of good lessons out of it. And in fact, Timor-Leste also is now intending to run for Human Rights Council at the United Nations in 2014 to 2024, 2026. Because this is not because of the prestige or the visibility of the country, but in fact, the country wants to contribute. The values of human rights need to be upheld. Respecting the women's rights, respecting the girls, women, these vulnerability of disabled people. Those are the values that Timor-Leste experienced in the past. So that's one thing that I'd like to highlight. In terms of its relation to trade, yes, you see, when the country respects these values, you can ensure that peace is guaranteed, because there will be no, how to say, I wouldn't say disqualified inequalities, but there is no dissatisfaction among the sector of the society, because people are feeling there is a peaceful environment for people to engage in their daily lives. There is a peaceful environment for dialogue with the leaders of the country. And the leaders themselves can also engage in regional and multilateral organization in terms of promoting the principles of trade, liberalism, and so on, you name it. So those are the things that Timor-Leste has got experience to offer, and we would like to share this experience with other G7 Plus fellow countries as well. This is part of the spirit of peer learning under the so-called fragile to fragile cooperation.
Thank you, Elder. And I'll go on to the second question from the audience. It is recently argued in the foreign policy article that China is a power in decline, with the CCP consolidating its base support even further, with little concerns over criticisms on its trade policy practices. Given the unlikely event where the US backs down on its demands vis-a-vis China's trade practices, what steps in trade policy are needed for conditions for peace in the Pacific region? China trade practices, what steps in the trade policies are needed for conditions for peace in the Pacific region to have peace, I guess, to prevail?
I can begin. I think one thing that those in Washington, policymakers in Washington and those in Beijing probably could agree to is that most likely China is not in decline. There are differences over trade policies and over trade measures that are strenuous. Now, can the WTO have a role in resolving those problems? I think it can. The issue of agricultural subsidies, for example, both the United States and other countries of the West and China see that there's too much subsidization. Now, they tend to look at it in terms of somebody else's subsidies rather than their own, but it is something to be resolved, and it can be resolved. Industrial subsidies are more than even agriculture a cause for friction between China and the agricultural exporting countries. This is something that can be resolved in the WTO. There's a lot that can be done in the WTO to reduce the level of tensions. It's not a cure-all. Nothing is a cure-all. China's a rising power, and it has an economy that has, in the words of the Chinese, a market economy with socialist characteristics. There'll be some friction. There was a lot of friction with Japan and the United States and its other trading partners in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s. And that's something one has to come to grips with. So the WTO has a strong role, I think, not a cure-all, but it has a role to play.
Thank you. And Elder?
I think Ambassador Alan Wolf has covered it, but I just wanted to say that there is a metaphorical thing saying that when a big country sneezes, everyone gets the cold. Yeah. So, so, and also the other metaphoric example is that when the two giants, the two elephants fighting, the grass are the ones who got crunched. Yeah. So in the context of Asia Pacific, along the lines of your question, Axel, I would say that we small countries, we just watch, we just monitor, and we will propose to you, we'll call you that as a multilateral body, you oversee this, and then we hope that there is a fair trading system applies in this country. So there is a level of playing field here applied to every country so that many small countries are not affected badly by the policies of these two giants in the world. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Elder. And to you, Elder, this question has to do with the silos between the trade and peace community. So how can silos be broken down within and across organizations to collaborate on trade for peace? How can we help capacity building at different levels, including university courses, training for diplomats, and trade for peace practitioners?
Thank you. That is a very important question, and I really, I'm really happy that you raised this. For us, we would say, I would categorize that we are new kid on the block. We come here to learn. As a small countries and a group of countries that are engaging in this trading system, we tend to benefit by learning from others who have got experience. So capacity building, for example, from other like-minded institutions, like the WTO Training Center in Geneva, or other donors, for example. You could offer capacity building by training our trade officials in our respective countries, providing them information, providing them the right information, providing them with appropriate tools in terms of engaging them in negotiation in both bilateral, regional, and global trading system. So those are the kind of things that we work in the principle of complementarity. Work together at the table rather than you work in silos and then everybody wants to show off their own little flag, raising the flag that I am the one who did this better than that. So this mode of work is outdated now. So now we call for a more comprehensive, a more systematic, and a more holistic approach, and now within actors and protagonists within the countries, so that the plight and the needs and the aspirations of the trade officials from G7 plus countries are heard, so that we can also engage this with our big.
Thank you, Dr. Da Costa. And Alan, I know this was a topic that was discussed yesterday, and there are several views expressed, but I would like your view on this topic in terms of what additional can be done to improve greater cooperation between the peace building and the trade community.
I think there's a lot of opportunity. It starts with joint research, understanding how the experience garnered by the peace building community can be helpful in the trade area. One of the major agreements that the WTO has reached has been the Trade Facilitation Agreement to try to reduce barriers at the border. Move one country to another, about a 24% on average tariff, just an increased cost just across the border. That's not the end of the story. Where there's domestic unrest, in fact, ships won't be unloaded, trucks won't be offloading the goods from ports, bringing them inside the country. I know I've driven across Northern Africa, where the police would stop our car every now and then, expecting a little bit of remuneration to continue the journey, sort of a toll system. The peace building community, of course, is dealing with something worse than usually the police. And we have to understand better what's taking place. WTO doesn't have offices around the world. It has one location in Geneva. The peace building community is every place. And every place that really is conflict affected in particular. We have to understand their needs of those countries better. They can articulate them to a great degree. That is the country's representatives themselves. But the outside observers will be very helpful too, to bring the expertise to the process so that actually what are crafted in rules in Geneva work on the ground around the world, particularly in conflict affected countries. So I think they could benefit from knowing what we're about in the trade world, in trade policy. And there's an enormous amount that we could benefit from the peace building community to make sure that trade for peace means that there can be more trade and there can be a better chance at peace.
Would you say it's peace before trade or trade before peace?
They're interdependent and they have to go hand in hand. But Elder has a comment.
If I may ask, I think I would, well, Ambassador Wolf mentioned that they are interdependent. You're right. But in our country's specific context, I think you need to have peace first before you engage in trade. Yeah. And that's what I want to say, that I'd like to engage. The trade has to be more inclusive. It has to be suitable to the context of conflict affected states. And if I want to emphasize Ambassador Wolf's point early on, in terms of peace building community, you're right. Because right now we are also engaging with the Peace Building Commission, or UN Peace Building Commission in the United Nations, and also other peace building community, that these kind of elements of contextualized peace at the country level has to be included in any curriculum, any materials, any pedagogic information that the WTO might want to share this with other member countries, in particular the little G7 plus countries groups. And that's very important. For example, someone yesterday mentioned, I think Akim mentioned yesterday, there are a lot of reforms at the country level. For example, the port system in Yemen, for example, it took 2 years to build a cane and so on. That's true in other fragile countries. It also happens. And this is because of its relation to structural problems, infrastructure challenges, and so on. That's why, sometimes people have this difference in terms of development, in terms of investment in infrastructure, and it has to take time. And time component here has to be understood by World Trade officials when dealing with the trade for peace. Thank you.
So
thank you.
Could I add one thing?
Sure, Alan.
It's not just, I have my WTO hat on all too often, but it's not just the WTO. The United States entered into free trade agreements with Jordan and Israel decades ago. And what happened? There was, I won't say a global value chain, but value chains, cross-border, international value chains that were created across borders. The whole idea of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is to break down borders within Africa so that there can be more internal trade within Africa, leading to a greater prosperity. And it'll be regional value chains. That's what's happened in Asia, regional value chains. The RCEP agreement is about regional value chains to a very large extent. So the trade for peace agenda is not just a WTO agenda in terms of trade. It is trade through regional agreements as well, regional integration. And it's an element that I think is going to be very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alan. To you, Elder, the question is posed to the G7 plus. How do you think G7 plus countries and their specific experiences can help design more effective and tailored technical assistance activities at the WTO and other fora?
Yes, that's a very good question. In fact, yes, since now the peace, trade and peace now is becoming the new vocabulary within the realm of World Trade Organization. With the G7 Plus, we simply ask for inclusion of a specific tailor of peace element and peace component into the capacity building programming for G7 Plus countries. For example, in your experience when you join WTO, for us it's like joining a club. It has duties and it has responsibilities. So the duties is that the countries have to perform certain reform in order to be able to join the WTO. The responsibilities, of course, and what are the benefits we can get from the WTO in return and so on. So in order to do this, during the whole process, there is a need for capacity building. And like Ambassador Wolf mentioned early on, this perspective, the aspiration need to be tailored, need to be listened to what the leaders are saying, because every country differs from one to another. I give you an example. For example, Afghanistan, they're already in the way advanced, but now they have this regressive moment right now. Whereas South Sudan and Yemen, you name it. So those are the countries that are really needed, including Timor. We need capacity building in terms of that. This is what leaders have been asking to WTO officials and your organization in order to provide this training. So I would very strongly call for peace element, peace component, and the needs for the conflict affected states have to be included.
Yeah, thank you, Elder. Alan, this question goes to you. What do you see as the role of local entrepreneurs in Trade for Peace?
Well, it's imperative that local entrepreneurial activity take place, and the trading system has to work in that direction. If there is no peace, the young are not going to be able to design apps. They're going to be off fighting in battles. So it's, as I said before, I think it's symbiotic. I understand that you have to have peace to have trade, but once you can get trade, you're going to sustain the peace. And it's not just entrepreneurial activity that is for older males. It's going to be for younger people. I'm not going to design any new apps. I hate to break that on the world as news, but it's going to be the younger people who do it. And I'd add the participation of women, that the opportunities for women, if there is peace, if there is trade, are going to, that's where the great growth is going to come, with the young and with the women. Not to leave out the males, they're not going to be totally forgotten, but they've been, the others have been disproportionately not moving ahead as quickly as they should to participate in the world. And there are real opportunities, I think, out there if we can make this Trade for Peace program truly effective.
And there is a question on how do you mainstream women and young people into on the agenda of Trade for Peace. Dr. Da Costa, would you respond to that, please?
Well, thank you. This is a very generic question, but when a country wants to sustain peace, as Ambassador Wolf mentioned on, with the G7 Plus believe that there can be no development without peace, and there can be peace without development. The same thing applies to trade, But when we talk about trade, it has to be an inclusive process, right? That's including the women, the young people, and the young entrepreneurs. It has to be included in this conversation, in this dialogue. So for us, it might be ideal to say, yes, we include, but in practice, it all depends to country-specific context in different countries. But I can assure you that in many G7 Plus countries, this is what happens. There is a dialogue among the leaders with the the people, for example, the women, the young entrepreneurs, and the youth people, in order to engage in this entrepreneurship and bring the country forward once the peace is already stabilized. That's what the experience in our countries reveal. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder. As we're almost out of time, I would like to ask this final question to you, Alan. Has to do with, as you know, the definition of peace and security have expanded to the realm of technology. Does the G7 Plus group have any provisions to foster digital security and bridge the technology capacity gap for LDC and SCAs? Actually, this is more for you, Dr. Da Costa.
I have to say that this is also, we are also embarking into this new territory, this new domain. So this is something that we will take it as a something that we will learn by doing. I don't have an answer, a definite answer for that, because this is a new territory for us. So I'll have to discuss this internally within our structure, our leaders, but this is something that we'll take this on board, of course.
Thank you.
Actually,
And then, yes, Alan.
just adding a word on it. When we were in Addis Ababa a year ago in February, you could go to a museum and see a plow that would have been very familiar to anyone living 2,000 years ago. And I was told 70% of the farming in Ethiopia is done with equipment of that type. Hasn't changed in all of those years. But you look on the web, and what you will see is a vibrant e-commerce degree of activity in a country that is conflict affected, was conflict affected. And you can see awards being given out for new apps designed by entrepreneurs in Ethiopia. No economy now, however small, however conflict affected, is isolated from the world of digital commerce. So I realize there are capacity constraints, and G7 Plus maybe can't do everything, but the fact of the matter is that they have a stake, and their voices should be heard on the e-commerce talks in Geneva, because they can benefit from them.
Thank you, Alan. And to the final question, Elder, working in Timor-Leste, how were you able to facilitate the relationship between the World Bank and government to help finance peace? Do you have any examples?
Yes. I'm sharing with you from the experience that I work in Timor-Leste over the past decade or so. Yes, as you know, Timor-Leste was inundated by so many advisors, so many world bodies, international financial institutions, and also UN agencies, you name it. Yeah. Your questions related specifically to the World Bank. Of course, the government, successive governments of Timor-Leste over the past 2 decades have engaged heavily with the World Bank. And the World Bank has got a program which they call Cash Flow Program, yeah, working with ILO, you know, facilitating the people to do some projects like, for example, building rural roads or cleaning the streets and so on, or building certain facilities like markets and so on. And this is like a cash flow program, and something that is really needed by the local people in order to be able to sustain their daily lives. This is part of the, if you want to call it in quotation words, like you're buying peace in order to sustain the peace dividends. Because from time to time, any violence can erupt because people are unemployed. Yeah. So this is the situation that was that happened at the time. In order to stabilize the situation, to give some peaceful mind and peace, tranquility in the minds and hearts of the people, they come up with this kind of programs, a short-term one, in order to be able to dissipate the potential conflict that might emerge within the Timorese society. So yes, it happened and it worked. Thank you.
Thank you, Elder. And Thank you, Alan. Let me thank again both of you for this rich discussion which we had in this session. Uh, I would like to now conclude with one final question. In one phrase, what would be your final message that you would like our audience to take away from this session? Alan, I would like to start with you.
Where there's trade, there can be peace.
And to you, Dr. Da Costa.
Multilateral trade system is no more multilateral if conflict affected states are not taken into account.
Wonderful. That was Dr. Elder Da Costa, General Secretary of the G7, and Ambassador Alan Wolf, former Deputy Director General, two Trade for Peace champions supporting this initiative. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today, and my special appreciation goes out to our audience for their active participation and to the Geneva Trade Platform for their support in making this session possible. Thank you all, and I wish you all a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you.